Hello, my name is Nikita Poljakov, and I would like to welcome you to the Urban Talks series at CAMP, which is part of the Prague Institute of Planning and Development. Today we will talk about stories. I hope you all like stories. As a journalist, I'm a big fan of them. And what needs more advocacy through stories than our environment? Sweden knows it, and it went so far to introduce the Viable Cities program for the future, to make cities more livable and viable for us in the future. And its main advocate is Per Grankvist, who is the chief storyteller for the program. Welcome, Per.
Thank you so much.
And today we will talk about which story needs to be heard and how to transform stories into reality, especially in larger cities like Prague. You guys can be part of it, of today's discussion. Just go to Slido, hashtag Campuj online with C, Campuj online, and ask the question. I will definitely address your questions during our conversation. And if you are a fan of these talks, please visit our social media and blog campuj.online. That's all from me from the start. Per, please, the floor is yours for your introductory presentation.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, and it's to share some of the ideas that we've been working with and the way we do things in order to and I look very much forward to our discussion afterwards, where I'm sure there's lots of things I can learn from you as well. Viable Cities is one of Sweden's 17 government-funded innovation programs. We are the largest one, and our ambition is to make a few cities in Sweden and 9 of them climate neutral by 2030. This is part of EU's Horizon Europe program, which aims to have 100 climate neutral cities by that year. And we actually are slightly ahead. We are working according to the mission-driven innovation approach, as is coined by economist Mariana Mazzucato, who just released this book related to the importance of mission. And what she tells in this book, and which is also part of our strategy, is basically the idea that the Americans had in 1960s. We're going to put a man on the moon, they said, and they had no idea how to do it. So we basically taken the same approach. By setting a high standard, by setting a high goal, then it's important. Then you allow yourself to think outside of the box. That's the main idea. By having a very clear mission, then we say, okay, let's try to do this differently. Let's try many things at the same time and see what works, see what fails, and then change. We have something around 100 to 150 million euros in order for funding to do this. So that's not much when it comes to city development. We are very much looking at ourselves as sort of extra gasoline, extra rocket fuel in order to help cities make this transformation. To do this, we also have something around 70 partners from the academic world, from the corporate world, from the NGO world, from all walks of life, organizations who are interested in this mission and are able to help with funding, with knowledge, with research and experts. And so in that sense, when you talk about the future, obviously it's difficult, because when you talk about a climate neutral future, what does that even look like? We don't know, because nobody actually has been in a climate neutral future. It seems kind of boring, actually. When you talk about the climate future, it's often we talk about it in the sense that we feel, okay, we can never even meet again, we can never drive a car again, we can never go on vacation by plane again. So it seems like a worse future. And so they've decided to bring in someone who can actually work with my dual background and sort of looking at from an economic point side and as a journalist trying to understand things, and say, let's do a part of this project, which is about storytelling, where we develop a method, which is now seemed to be one of the world-leading methods. There was not that method in this field. A method would allow cities to communicate the future to the citizens in order to enhance their understanding of the future. And so I wanted to give you an introduction. This is an introductory program. I wanted to give you an introduction to the storytelling as a method as well, and what we do, and to understand the concept here. We have research from various universities. So one of you, human behavior sciences, this sustainable consumption, all that stuff. But then we bring on the ideas of storytelling and to see how that can work. I should also ask the studio to lower the sound. I get the sound from the studio in my here at the moment. So while you do that, I will change into the presentation mode that I've prepared for you this tonight. So you can say this is storytelling as a method, but you could also call this what all your favorite movies have in common. So the main problem here, the goal is to make cities climate neutral. And the problem is nobody understands what that feels like. If you look at the sort of architectural drawings of the future, they're always boring. They're emotionally sterile version of the future. Here's what the future looks like throughout Europe. It's sterile, it's perfectly clean streets, everybody is white, and we also get versions of flying cars or drones. This is not, nobody of us could relate to. So we don't see ourselves in that pod on that sort of balcony. We sort of can't understand it. We have to think, how can you tell stories that are much more relatable in a near future scenarios? That's what we're working with here. So generally speaking, what we need to know here, what we do is science-based, sort of really science-based. But when telling stories, that's not at all how we operate. We need science to understand how we need to change. But in order to convey that, it's overrated. And if you doubt me, I have one point for you. Donald Trump, he became the most influential man in the world by not using a single fact whenever he done it during his entire 4 years. It was lies after lies after lies. It didn't matter because stories are the best. The ones who did tell the best stories rule the world. And so if we want to change the world, we need to understand the nature of stories. What is important here is to talk stories. That stories do not have to be believable for us to be engaged, but they need to be engaging for us to believe. This is a scene from WALL-E. It's a fantastic Pixar movie, it's one of my favorites. And in this particular scene, we have a garbage compactor who falls in love with a droid. This is on Earth, set in the future. There's no human living here anymore. And the garbage compactor falls in love with the droid. And one day the droid happens to identify a plant, and that's why it flashes green on her chest. And so she goes into lockdown and sends a signal to outer space. And Wally, our hero, does not understand it. So he thinks that maybe she got sort of cross at him or something. So he wants to take her to all the places where they enjoy together, like looking at the sunset. And he decorates her with the old Christmas lights and trying to hold a hand this way. And we cannot understand this, of course, we haven't been in this situation, but that we all at the same time have been emotionally in this situation. And because we can emotionally relate to it, we can also relate to the story. And so whenever we tell a story about the future in a city, it has to be a setting that we can relate to. And so what we're working with is trying to create a framework that allows cities to understand how to create near future scenarios that make sense and inspire change. Scenarios that are not marketing, because we all hate marketing. Even people who work in marketing have ad blockers. So I assume they hate marketing too. Ad marketing is something that's being pushed on you, but stories is something that you're drawn into and you want to follow. So it's trying to make that sort of merge of behavioral psychology and engage people with good life within the planetary boundaries. So in order to do this, I think it's important to realize that the brain is a story processing machine. We are not logical animals at all. That's completely made up. We think ourselves as logical, especially if you're a white middle-aged man. You think you're logical as fuck, but you're not. Our brain invents narrative even when there are none. We will trying to think, maybe it's this way, maybe it's that way. We can sort of use the sort of slightest ideas and then sort of trying to stitch a narrative to it. And that's obviously something we can use if we use emotions to it. So here's a short study, a short film I wanted to show you. Let's see if it kicks up on YouTube. This was actually done in 1944. It's objects who are moving completely randomly in this movie, which is around a minute long. But when you see this, you will see these arrows interacting with each other. And if you're like most people, your brain is now making up a story. Is the big arrow trying to push the little arrow? Are they working together? Are they afraid of the ball or not? Is the big arrow angry? Is it what's happening here? This is one of the most famous studies that done. It continues for another minute. I don't need to tell you all. The thing is, there is no story here whatsoever. It's just random objects moving around. But our brains function to create that story. Wasn't the big triangle a little more angry and aggressive than the smaller one? We think. and that we construct stories from emotions. And so we could actually use that going forward. Let's see if I can click. So it's important when we look at this, it's also important to define. So we have storytelling and we have a narrative. And I think sort of storytelling is the entire craft. And then in that, you have a narrative. And if you're trying to tell stories, you need actually to understand what's going on. Some people are natural storytellers. They will do it instantly. Some people are just boring. They tell stories in a very sequenced way. This happened, this happened, this happened. So in our framework, we look how you can sort of do stories in a very deliberate way. And if we take back to look at the theory behind it, this is what all your favorite movies have in common. It doesn't matter if you are very fond of Lion King or Star Wars or Matrix, they all follow the same pattern. And this is based on another concept on the 1940s called the monomyth, or more famously known as the hero's journey. It's an interesting story. It's never linear. You have a hero. That hero is getting lost and is find something. There's a tension. You want to achieve something that isn't possible. You find someone who can help you, and it goes around like this. And this is something we need to know and need to master if you are to tell stories about the future. Science fiction is basically the same thing about telling stories about the cities of the future. And how can we make people want to live there, want to be able to relate to it? I think that's important here. And all the stories basically is this. You have someone in the ordinary world that's on the top of the circle. They have a call to adventure. They say, no, that's not for me. That's a refusal to core. They meet someone, a mentor, no, you can actually do this. And so they at some point define themselves, okay, I can do this. And they cross from the ordinary world into the special world. They are put into various tests. They meet enemies, they meet foes, allies and enemies, and who can they trust and all not. That's the basic story. Then they eventually approach what's then called a concept of the dragon's den, to make it really clear here. There is the ordeal. Will they fight? Will they win? Will they lose? And then often they find they seize the treasure. They come back. There might be some kind of roadblock on the way home where they realize that they have been transformed. And so they come home into the ordinary world, resurrected. They return home and everything is ordinary again. This is the basic story of all your favorite movies. It's also your favorite books, and the theater's plays are all structured in some way or the other by this very story. We can look at the Matrix, the Spider-Man, the Lion King, the Lords of the Rings. They're all this. We have the start. There's an ordinary world, there's a call to adventure, and you can go on and then move through this sort of snake and see all kinds of stuff that's happening. And it's actually fascinating when you structure this way. I won't get into detail. You have to trust me on this one, but everything is basically constructed on the same thing. And that's what makes stories great. So whenever we tell stories as part of our framework, we use the same thing. Here we used as example to tell something about the future. You can also tell it in one of the oldest tales on the European continent, which is basically then of the Little Red Riding Hood. You have to tell a story to identify the moral and the message you want to convey based on facts. In this terms, we want to convey to little girls and boys that they should be careful in the woods. So we consider the audience. Then we introduce a hero. We have a specific location. Location is important to sort of every general story. It's no story no one will understand, but it's a very specific location. And we did some studies where I looked at the Little Red Riding Hood, how that's been portrayed in books, in children's books all across the European continent. And it's important to see and interesting to see how the portray of the forest varies from the Northern Europe to Central Europe to Southern Europe. The forest look completely different. And so it also looks completely different if you read Little Red Riding Hood in Swedish, in French, or in Spanish. And I think that's important of localizing your story and make it relevant here. There should, of course, be a quick backstory for identification and relatability. We should have a call to adventure. They should be told from a human perspective. One of the problems when we do when tell stories about the cities is that we tell it from nowhere. It's a voice coming from somewhere telling you something that in the future, everything will be perfect. But it needs to be told from a human perspective on the ground, on the street. And that's what's happening here. And then we have to have attention. There always has to be attention in a story, or otherwise it's a boring story. Something unexpected happened. How can we make it? And then we should have a hero, which should never be shame. You don't like heroes that are stupid. So we should try and explain why the hero gets into this situation and how we can have a sustainable solution that can actually provide a solution in order to then ease the tension and having an improved quality of life at the end. This is basically what we're trying to do, and then in sort of a slightly bigger project. So to exemplify how this can look like, we've done a pilot project in Malmö in the southern part of Sweden, which is one of our cities. I'm not going to show you the entire thing, but we did a story that is basically a day in a life in the city, where we want to show different mobility solutions that are already available, completely sustainable, and how that sort of can be weaved into the ordinary life of a citizen. There's tons and tons of research and strategy and everything going back to it that will make the story look really easy, but it's fairly complicated. But that's what the method is trying to get at. The main point when you want to tell a story about the future, you want it to feel it to be documentary. It should never be a drawing, but it should feel documentary. It should get the feeling that, the future is already here, only unevenly distributed, like sci-fi and author William Gibson said. So we find someone in the city who'd be a main character that actually is living that life that we want to achieve. Basically saying that not that we should all change, but we should scale up the portion of every society that already are living the way we want to be. To scale up a behavior is much easier from a conceptual point of view than saying that everybody needs to change. We also talk a lot about sort of we don't talk about the importance of change. We have to change for climate change. No, nobody understands that. That's too conceptual. But understanding the opportunity to increase a quality of life, it will be a much better way to live this way. It will improve us. That's where we put our focus. Also, the story is always about fulfilling human needs, never what technology can do. All the technology that we need to live a complete sustainable life is already here. That's not the thing. The way we meet in Zoom and online like tonight, rather than being in person, that I, of course, would have wanted to be in Prague with you tonight. It's not that we got new technology, that this technology was around a year ago. It's just that we stopped working as stupid as we used to do. So all technology, and that's something we want to portray. That this allows us to do new things that will improve our life. And also to highlight functional and social struggles that are made visible and to show how to overcome them. Sometimes we oversell the future, and I cannot state enough, that everything will be perfect. But in the future, of course, there will be someone who will have sort of completely sustainable clothing made of recycled fiber and circular and whatnot, and he will still commit adultery. There will still be juicy hamburgers that you will make you get a heart attack because they're so fat, but they will be vegan. They're already available today. You can still be sort of having still be able to smoke and have too much wine whenever you wanted. You might still go on a car. You might still have kids in the back of the car who are sort of going berserk, and you just hate the little bastards, but the car will be electric. But it's important to sort of design and tell those flaws of everyday life for us to relate to, because we all relate to those instances probably, but relate to sort of an electric fleet of vehicles is not something. So we could use that something that we could relate to tell something important about the future. And that's what we're trying to do. And then also, we also use this as tools within a city to do multi-layered storytelling, which conveys that there are lots of relations. Sometimes we say that it's easy, as few the stuff that we will talk more about later, is that you and I can do to change our behavior in order to lower our emissions really quickly. There's also lots of stuff in the cities. A city is a complex machine, and we have to be able to visibly make sure that people understand, okay, we have ecosystem services, we have the park department, we have the road department, we have all kinds of private actors that all work together to create an opportunity for us to live things, but also to create structures that prevent us from living things. And by doing stories that could display them, we can actually get a more nuanced understanding of what's needed to live the future that we envision. So basically, in our stories, they are all documentary, they're all sort of multifaceted and multi-layered. But as a part, we can sort of say that here's Caroline working remotely, that's a yellow, so that's her individual choices. We can then say that she's a city employee, so there's sort of actually things going on in the city, decisions made in blue. that affects her. We have the ecosystem services, we have other stakeholders, and that way we can get understanding of the complexity at work in this situation, rather than say, oh, she can choose to be sustainable. Yes, she can, but that's only because a lot of other decisions often. So that's how we tell it. And I would tell it frame by frame, very simple. It should always be PowerPoint, it should always be photography, it should always be sort of fairly ugly, to be honest, like this, because that sort of lowers the bar for anyone to use this tool. And every other image is then looking at the layers, and then the yellow images here are basically the story going forward. And it's also tricky because you have to sort of be able to tell certain stories about services going on in the city that just happen. She's so safe because there's a bike lane that she forgets where she is and she gets lost. And that is one thing that we can sort of say, here's we actually have a situation where someone feels very safe, and then this can happen. So I wanted to stop there. This is sort of work in progress. We are constantly releasing things about this framework. The framework itself hasn't been completely released yet, but there's a lot of stuff that we're sharing because that's something that we'd like to do. And there's huge interest in what we do. So here you can on Medium, it's where we find and where we share all the stuff that we do at Vibrant Cities, and especially on storytelling. You can find it on my Medium page here. So I think I'll stop there and then looking forward to having another conversation here instead.
Thank you, Per. Thank you very much for your introductory insights, for contextualizing the topic. Can you please start off by maybe describing what is a Viable Cities program and what have you achieved so far?
I think it's when it comes to achievement, the KPI we use is the way our cities is moving forward to becoming completely climate neutral. And that's going to happen by 2030. So we're basically just starting. We've been operating for two and a half years now. And as a government funded program, one of our ambitions is also to make sure that this knowledge that we do, that once we understood that there's sort of huge interest in this, that it's sort of we are pioneers in the European context, we also made sure that everything we do should be in English and should be easily shareable in order for us to share knowledge and to do outreach like tonight, but also for us to be able to bring on ideas from the rest of Europe primarily in order to help these cities move forward. So we are sort of that's why we're described as sort of rocket fuel, but we're not financing their shift to a climate neutral, but rather working and financing research in order to find knowledge and do pilot projects that then they can learn from each other.
It's very difficult to argue with the idea that story helps with everything, basically, because when you tell a story, it's easily understandable, it's relatable, etc. You've been doing this since 2019, so it's been two years approximately, if I'm correct. What have you find out? How do people perceive stories about the future of climate, and what are the largest obstacles that you are facing when talking to people about it?
I think what we found so far is that sort of the realization that we can have a climate neutral future. We can live a climate neutral life here already. So as you might notice, I talk about our goal being climate neutral. What we want to achieve is to have a higher quality of life and lower emission. And that's because we fairly quickly find out that sort of the government goal of climate neutrality doesn't mean anything to anybody. So we had to rephrase that in order to make it something that, oh, I want higher quality of life. Oh, well, I want that. Sort of trying to translate it to something that could be connected to people's needs and desires, and trying to sort of understand the main. So I think that was one of the key things we discovered here, and then trying to sort of find. Looking at sort of science on how people behave and how people change behavior and what kind of obstacles they have. So the pilot we did in Malmö, for example, that is very limited to be for a target group that is middle-aged women, just like our main hero here in the city center of Malmö, to still operate the car and to show them that it's possible to ditch the car and live a complete life anyway. And I think it's important also that we tell stories that are direct and direct at someone. If you tell general stories to general people, you're not telling anyone anything. So you have to be very specific, and then find other stories. But at the same time, one of my lessons has been always that, I mean, you think that we should do something and you tell a story, and then you forget that, is it possible to change behavior? We started doing a pilot in Umeå in the northern part of Sweden, and in the rural parts of that municipality, we were tasked trying to get people who had 2 cars to ditch 1 car. They were often men, they were 50 plus, so they're basically the hardest people to change behavior, because we adult men, we don't change, generally speaking. But sadly enough, I have facts on my side. And we started to talk to these people and say, well, you should, and felt a bit like sort of coming from the capital, say, hello, fellow citizens, you should do this instead because it's much easier. You should take the bus, for example. And I also like, yes, I agree in theory, but the bus never stops here. It comes sort of once a day. And so it doesn't matter how much stories you tell if you don't have sort of make sure that you've found out sort of, is it possible to change behavior here, or is the structure wrong? And I think that sort of, I become more humble in sort of understanding the way that works. And also another thing that I touched on earlier is sort of the importance of connecting it to local stories, local tradition, local ideas about yourself. I shouldn't be put sort of in charge of telling a story of what a sustainable life should be in Prague, because I know nothing about Prague. I know nothing about the stories you tell yourself. But in the northern part of Sweden, I started then saying, okay, what's the story you tell? And then so here in Umeå, there's 2 things that are in all our stories. It's the big river and it's the big forest. So if you want people to change, if you encompass that somehow, and that made into something, a test we did where we talked about people saying that, okay, we didn't put in the full test, but it was a concept we did with basically saying, you shouldn't say you should move to renewable energy, but rather saying that if you switch to this energy, the local energy utility, you will feel a mighty river flowing through your socket. And that is much more locally patriotic. And we did. I also did the same. I was sort of invited to put a few ideas forward when it comes to the Scottish government and the climate propositions, the climate laws. They were great. I had nothing to add beyond just adding Scottish everywhere. They shouldn't be doing climate revolution in order to do 250,000 or whatever new jobs. It's 250,000 Scottish jobs. You don't care about there should be more jobs in general, but more Czech jobs. And I think that is, I think it's important here to make the local connection, and it could be on neighborhood level, city level, very individual level, and then you can relate to it, and then you can also make the change.
I see what you're doing there, and I think it can be effective. Who are you talking to when you tell your stories? There is a question about various stakeholders that you are involved in your local stories. Are these institutions we are talking about, or do you get a chance to reach people and get them involved in this debate?
The idea from the start was to make a vehicle for talking to people, the general public, or parts of the general public that we were trying to aim this. But what we found in the big pilot study we did in Malmö was that actually it could be used as a vehicle to understand complexity within the municipality organization. Various departments now understood, oh, so this connects to this, and this happened as our hero moved through the city during the day. So they understand how they related to each other. And that created a common goal and a common sense. And then I also think that it could be shown. Someone said, well, this is too ugly. We need to make it more polished, make it more advertised. We should make a movie. But I think it's sort of, we're not done thinking about that, and I'm open to ideas and suggestions, because if it's too polished, if it's too much of a movie, here's what the future will look at, then you fall into the trap of it being advertising. So I think we're now thinking about this should be a vehicle for discussion, where we also operate on the sort of general idea that we should enhance trust in our institutions. This is one of the EU's goal, and we are a part of that.
Yeah,
I think it does work, because we've actually cast our heroes. They work in the municipalities, and you can see, okay, actually they are walking the talk. But it will be interesting to see where this method can be used and where it's most effective. But so far, it's been used internally in cities, and they found it to be a really good way to bridging and understanding the complexity and understanding, okay, there's a lot of things going to happen. We're not going to change it by one local law or one local initiative, but a lot of things at the same time.
Because, and this question also from the public, from our viewers, and it's related, depends on who you listen to. So, for example, in the Czech Republic, the trust in the institution is not as high as in Nordic countries, so to say. And if there were an advocate for nuclear energy, green energy, you name it, he would have a very difficult position in basically being heard and being trusted. So can this work? Is it scalable, this idea, or do you think this is like site-specific project that you are starting now, or how do you think, from your experience from other countries, how do you think it's usable? Or maybe we need an influencer like Leonardo DiCaprio telling us, to take care of our environment.
Unless he's your neighbor, I don't think that would work. It needs to be someone who's physically more related and relatable as well, perhaps. This is a model that can be used everywhere, but it has a certain elements to it. How do we tell stories locally? How do we make sure that some stories that would work perfectly in a Danish setting would probably not work at all in a Czech setting because of local regional variations? But if you tell a story in a good way, and it doesn't fall into the trap of being sort of advertising. We had a fun story in Malmö where one of the sort of tensions of the day is that the main character, she gets her bike stolen. And then the municipality said, no, we don't get bikes stolen because we fixed that. That was last year, and the bike theft are down and so on. And we said, we don't care about that, because if you lived in Malmö, everybody got the bike stolen at that specific place. It allows the audience to relate to her and to her feelings and to understand why she then has to take the bus somewhere. So it's always that sort of navigating, making sure that we don't put our best foot forward, that not everything is rosy and fantastic. And maybe if our hero is an advocate for nuclear energy, then it has to be some tension. He cannot be sort of an activist for it. No hero can be an activist. There have to be multiple versions. It's all about trust. A story you don't trust is a story that isn't working. So if your ambition is to get a story that's actually working, you need to get people to believe it.
These media theories, and some people say, when you want to be impactful, you just have to scare people. And climate topic is very easy to use as a scary tool. We're all gonna die if you don't do anything about it. That's like the first thing I would say. Isn't it maybe this the way to go, to scare them? Why doesn't this work? If we keep telling them, this is like the extreme situation and we are beyond that, and our children will not be able to live within the same environment as we do, why isn't this enough?
I think that it's because we cannot relate to it. If we see one of our children or any child on their way over a cliff, we will jump to and we will save them because we see this is an extreme situation. But it doesn't feel like that way. It doesn't feel like it's a climate emergency. It comes slowly, it creeps on us. It's only when we talk about our parents and they talk about their winters that we realize that something has happened. And so it's difficult to relate to. And also, whenever you talk to someone and you're trying to shame them, which has been a very popular thing these days, I think it's, there's basically no science that would say that this is working, that you should be doing this. And especially if some other authority comes and do it, or another country saying, you in the Czech Republic, you must be more like us Swedes. You think just that I'm a sort of an asshole. And so we have to make sure that we sort of lead by example. Here's what worked for me. I did one small thing, and here's my experience. This worked, this didn't work. Okay, so here's how to go about it. That's much more a human way to have a conversation and to lead people into it, and to lead by sort of example. And I think that the general shaming has its place in some cases, especially if media is involved. We've seen a couple of those climate demonstrations where there's been a bit of shaming involved. But for you and me to change, if I shame you every time we see each other, we will see each other less frequently because it's just annoying. So it's about holding hands and show this is actually possible. You have to show it, see what I did. And that's much more of a way forward because nobody likes to be shamed.
And when we predict our future, and you showed it basically in your presentation, when we look at the future of the cities that are about to become emission-free, they all look the same. Why do we keep portraying them like this? Don't you think it impedes our ability basically to be more creative in thinking about the future? You know, there's a lot of energy companies that are showing these pictures, you know, that we are all like flying in the cars with some isolated trees being there, which is quite scary idea of the carbon-free future, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely, too well. And I think one of the main problem is that people who design the future or get to draw the future, they look like you and me. I mean, we have basically the same glasses, we're the same age. There's no women involved, there's no people of color involved, there's no sort of diversity, and that's why they're so similar. And so there's not enough stakeholders being heard, or there's not enough of involvement in that. And it's always fun to draw sci-fi images, I guess. Flying cars are cool. So I think it's sort of, you want to make these small images where we have slight impact, you have sort of slightly bigger bike lanes. That's not as exciting. But what is fascinating in the past 6 months or so, we see much more in social media, people sharing sort of how you can alternate the city street with fairly small measures and then show something. Here's what it looked like with some more trees, or with wider bike lanes, or more benches, or a tram instead of cars and whatnot. So I think we're getting closer to that. And there's also another part of it, which is sort of, if you want to get engagement, show them something that they can't relate to. Say, okay, fine, I guess. I don't know, you're the experts. It's very excluding a way of telling a story. And I think it's portrayed as imagination, but I would say it's sort of lack of imagination. Draw the future any way you want. That's something kids does. And so I think it's also needs sort of the people working in city planning needs to be better at this, think harder and think about sort of what things in the future will we still have. Will we flatten the city center of Prague to make the future? Most likely not. You tried once to sort of to flatten the city center, and no one was really happy with that. You built it up again, and so I think that sort of it's been the same thing all over Europe. But we tried that, and then okay, we need to do something else. We need to take into consideration our history and our heritage, and also from a resource perspective, frankly.
There are stories that support the idea that we should look towards green future, but there are some stories that are fake news stories, and I don't know how much is it involved in your everyday life when you not only have to tell the stories about green future, but disprove stories that are basically fake. Does it happen to you, and do you have a strategy for this? Because in this country, in the Czech Republic, it's not uncommon that there is a lot of people that don't basically believe in global warming still in 2021.
I think it is a number of ways you can relate to this, and I think the main point should be facts are facts. You're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to facts. If you don't believe in global warming, you're an idiot. Full stop.
Facts don't matter. So you said also in your presentation, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's also about if we have a mission that we know is science-based and we're going in some direction, it can be a waste of energy to trying to convince people who don't want to be convinced. We had a lot of climate skeptics in Sweden who are very loud in the sort of public discussion maybe 10 years ago. They came from the public sector, they came from the industry sector. They said that we're very old and very wise, and we think this is a hoax. And they also invited me to some seminars to talk to them, and I always declined. Why should I waste my energy in trying to persuade them? They're old, they're male, they're not going to be they're not going to get more kids. They will die out soon. Let's focus on the future instead. We should not waste energy on those people. They will be proven wrong. They are already
aren't
wrong.
they those still the decision makers that are basically moving, so to say, the economic vehicles in countries forward, basically deciding which energy mix we prefer in the countries, etc., or work as managers in big international companies that basically are part of the story, right? If you decide to become green as a company, that's one thing. If you don't believe in it and you're director of the company, it can have an effect as well.
Absolutely, but they are also on the wrong side of history. They're on the wrong side of facts. And if all the neighboring countries are moving in a different direction and they don't, they are idiots. And they will go away eventually because the law of nature is working against them. The law of the market is working against them. The law of sanity is working against them. And I also think that if we place too much emphasis on them, we might forget what we can do ourselves. The agency we all have to change our life for a more climate-friendly future and lower our own personal emissions. And by doing that, we can set an example for other people to see, and we can start talking about it from a reference point of, I managed to do this, even if that sort of idiot is in charge. And then I should also wanted to make a shout out to all these sort of city mayors out there who have a lot of power and influence in cities, and they can really make a change, even though the leadership of the country is looking in the wrong direction. That's where I get the hope and inspiration when I talk to these sort of city mayors from all over the world who talk about passionate what they're doing in their neighborhood and that neighborhood, changing this and that. And I think we should spend more energy on patting their backs and saying, you're doing the right thing and I stand behind you and I want to go more about that, rather than putting too much emphasis on people who are basically dead wrong.
Mm-hmm. Prove me wrong, but I live in a city, in a capital city. I feel like all the information that are regarding the green future and everything is centered here in the city. Shouldn't be there a storyteller for maybe rural areas that are underdeveloped and basically are without the information, and will be a big topic for us for the future because this is not only a problem of the city, so to say.
I think that there needs to be people telling stories about the future of all facets of a nation and city, the city center and the local neighborhoods and the urban sprawl and sort of what should that look like here. It's natural to start in cities because we get the highest density of citizens and we have the most people. That's why we start there. But I think now one of the effects of the pandemic is that people feel that, okay, if I can't go out in the city, maybe I want to go elsewhere. There's an important sort of stress on the green areas and why that's important, and green facades and whatnot. Actually, you get mentally more well if you're close to a park and etc. And so a lot of people have found that outside of the city is something different. And if you can get a reliable internet connection, I'm actually fine. So I think there will be a new green wave, and they will probably bring more urban ideas into the countryside, and there will be a merge. We can say, actually, this is another way and a smarter way to do it. Also, one of the key issues that I've learned over the years, and I've been working in sustainability for 15 years now, and specializing in companies working in sustainability, that's one of my backgrounds, is that the key here is not to talk about sustainability and not to talk about climate change, but to talk about how we use resources. Because every time you use resources smarter, we can agree that's common sense. We can use less porcelain in one of the mugs, or we can do something else that makes stuff last longer and be more effective. Every time you do that, every time you save resources, you save money. There's 100% correlation. But sometimes when I talk to people and talk to skeptics, I sort of don't talk about climate sustainability, but how could we use resources cleverer? How can we deploy them smarter? And the fun fact is, it doesn't matter if I mean China or Malaysia or India or France or wherever, people can always talk about common sense. And that common sense is sort of built into it. And that is a universal thing. So moving away from the politics and polarization of the issues, like how can we make this smarter? How can we make people live sustainable in the countryside? How can they produce things that could be used and whatnot? So it is a politicizing issue. I'm completely aware of it.
Per, there's this question about this responsibility that I think is implied in the topic that we talk about, and it's individual responsibility, and there will be shared responsibility of the city, of its stakeholders that we keep talking about. The question is, people and some people may sometimes say that unless big firms, big companies, and countries, state become sustainable, why should I do it as an individuality, as a person? Because I won't have an impact anyway. Do you address this topic, or how would you address this?
Well, facts are that there's lots and lots of happening in companies moving sustainable. The most innovative companies in the world are going sustainable head on. The finance market with BlackRock, one of the biggest investors in the world, are pouring money into this. It seems to be happening slowly, but it is changing, and that's giving me hope. And they can be quicker than the public sector, but they're pushing them in the right direction. When it comes to your own personal responsibility, of course, the future isn't here, and what you do today will affect your future. If you eat too much animal proteins, for example, you will be less healthy. There's plenty of science to back that up, for example. So you can actually be fairly selfish into this and then look at your own health and your own wallet and so on. But if you think that I can't affect anything, then you're actually victimizing yourself. And is that the kind of person you want to be? Altogether, we change something. And we know from facts and science that the most influential influential factor to get someone to live sustainable is if they have a friend who already does it. So I think it's sometimes people make it, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. Of course it matters. Everything we do matters. And who influences big corporations? We do, with our decisions. So I think it's, if you think about it in that it's not a cynical way of thinking, but maybe a lazy way of thinking. We all can, and we all should, and it's actually quite fun to start to do these micro changes. Shouldn't aim for changing everything at all the time, but we could you go to a second-hand shop and you find one of these, and it looks the same as a new one, and there's been another old man having it before me, and it's of perfect quality. It's probably bulletproof as well. It's really old and really hot. But then you start finding small things in your everyday life that you find I did this, and then I think it's something happens with your relation to yourself as well.
There has been more pressuring topic, or at least in the media and as a priority, COVID. Prior to COVID, I think climate change was the main international topic, so to say. Do you experience that your stories are not heard as much as they have been, maybe?
I can't say that really. Obviously, in 2020, a lot of media were focusing on one single story, and so that actually took a lot of bandwidth. But at the same time, I think the COVID has been a story with very little hope. We hope to get a lot of things, but it never gets there. We never get enough vaccine. People get sicker. It's a problem. It is not going away, and we will live with this for a few years, believe me. But climate change can actually provide a story of hope in the sense that you can actually change something and do something. And also, I think that cities, they're always very local. And the way we understood the pandemic is basically it was a local pandemic. I didn't care if the hospitals were full in in Prague. I cared about my local hospital in Stockholm. I didn't at all care about all hospitals, but just my hospital. I didn't have enough capacity. So we rediscovered the important neighborhood and so on. And I think that is the way forward in talking about climate change. How is it affecting our river? How is it affecting our seasons? How is it affecting this and that? And I think that's the way forward, trying to get climate change from that sort of at 30,000 feet level and then get it down to, okay, what's happening in my neighborhood? Why is it so hot? Why is it more raining more now? Why can't I have this that I used to have as a kid and so on? So again, local is key to understanding and to get people to change. Because the closer to us, the easier we have to take something sort of for real.
Mm-hmm. There is a question from Nicola. What do you think is the most important thing, or what if you would have to give an advice, for example, for the city that would like to pursue sustainable project? What is the most important thing, what has the biggest impact on success of pushing through such a project? Do you have an advice? What is the most crucial thing to think about?
Well, if we know sort of the effects that the behaviors individual citizens have in a city that affect sort of the climate change, it's the amount of animal protein we eat. That's indirect and direct. That's around 50% of all emissions in the world, including transport and all that, to get the food to your table. So getting people to eat other things than meat is a good idea. Transportation is a huge factor, but also the way we consume is an even bigger factor. So how can we make sure that there are structures in place that makes it easier to do sustainable choices? This is the concept of nudging, rather than to do unsustainable, because people will do the easiest thing all the time. They will never do the most moral thing. They will do the easiest thing. How can it be more easy to take a bike, easier to take a bus and a tram? How can it be easier to find secondhand clothing? How can it be easier to find carpools that we can share, all the sharing economy, and create structures for that? And that is the way forward. I think that is the most important. And then there should be some things in place in order to help people to understand and rediscover the advantages also of eating a plant-based food, of course. But then that's in a sort of a reasonable way, trying to get everyone to be vegan in the city of Prague. I mean, that's just foolish. But getting them to understand what's important and what means that might not be important. Jonathan Taffram Forward talks in his book about sort of it's called the weather something. We are the weather. I have it here. He talks about saving the planet at breakfast. So breakfast and lunch should be no animal proteins, and then you can have it at dinner, because everyone has a relationship to that dinner. And that's actually a good way forward. You can have some and you change some. But in general, the city can do is consumption, make it easy to recycle, make it easy to do that. And also in transportation, help your people do the right choice and feel good about it and enhance their quality of life. So because having a city municipality saying, we should enhance your quality of life, people say, yes, go ahead, that's perfect. People like that.
So you think by presenting them this good side of the story, basically make them help to make right decisions. But you know, what I feel from people that are maybe a little bit concerned about the future is that they are concerned that something will be taken away from them. As you keep saying that, okay, you won't be driving a car, I don't know, diesel car, you will drive electric car. But that's the exact point when then this concern becomes, they want to take away my world, the world that I'm used to, the world that I grew up in, you know. Vegans want to take my food, my grandma's rootedness on history and everything. It's very difficult to maybe tackle these. How do you tackle these ideas or these concerns within people that something is leaving this world?
Well, the world is constantly changing, of course. That's one thing. Sort of everything is changing. But I think that, I mean, you're touching on an important point. Your grandmother's sort of steak on Sundays is important, has a certain significance. It's not about the steak, it's about the love she put in the meal. And so that should stay. But do you need to eat steak every day? Maybe not. But if you talk about it as sort of, you have to not do it because of the climate, then you take something away. But if you add something, an aspect or a filter on your menu, say, okay, let's make sure you eat healthier because it's good for you. So it's more reaffirming a positive message rather than taking away, leading you to understand, actually, this is a wiser decision. Having a car in a metropolitan area is just stupid. There's no basis for the idea that it's good. It's all about the old 90s, sort of the 20th century. I have a car, I'm independent, I'm masculine and all that. And there's a new generation coming that doesn't have that, and we can also use them. But allowing people say, well, you should, of course, you should have your independence. Whenever you want to have a car, you should get a car. Do you want to own that car or not? Probably not, because that's stupid. But sharing cars is better. And then again, we put the emphasis on how we can actually enhance your quality of life and also maybe enhance your economy rather than taking away. So getting people to feel, oh, this is something that is better. And the more we know about climate change, the more we know about what's need to change, the easier it is for us to go out there with our being sort of index finger and say, no, you need to change. But I think that also, generally speaking, before tackling and pointing out other people's sins, we might want to start with our own and think about what we can do. I live a car-free life, but I have pool cars, so I can talk to people at dinner. This is what I like. This is what I hate. When you want to go big time shopping on Saturdays and not have a car, that's of course stupid. But then I changed to order online food, so I don't have to not need to spend some time at all going for food. That became better. So trying also just to portray and convey it, it's difficult stuff. It's not easy to change. Nobody likes changing except if you go first. So it's at the basic human nature. Be kind to yourself, be kind to your neighbor, help them, talk about it in sort of more a forgiving way rather than saying you're bad and we all will die if you continue, because you will only lose friends and the world will end anyway.
Are you a proponent of activities such as Earth Hour, etc., etc.? There is a criticism around it. Are you, because there are also stories that connect people. How do you perceive them?
I think all sort of symbolic acts are important to put sort of emphasis on the fact that we are trying. But critics is trying to portray Earth Hour as something that is, if you do this once a year, 1 hour, then you're done. Of course, that's not factual. So you also have to be careful. Why do I do this? Well, I put light in my window on Saturday just to show my neighbors that actually we are in this together. It's sort of a visual way of connecting us. It's not going to say climate at all. So you have to be careful about it. But do I listen to people criticizing me if it? No, because they don't understand the facts. And I rather sort of hold hands with people who are moving in the right direction and get more people on. But I'm also, so as again, trying not to shame people, but sort of look more on the positive and optimistic, but not simplistic way of life. It's hard as fuck to change. We all know that. So if I say it's hard to change, you can relate to me rather than say, okay, it's super easy to change. You do all this at once and everything will be perfect. Nobody ever did that. Again, coming back to the relatable small actions and then stepping up.
Per, you touched upon an interesting topic, and young people as being a driver of change. Do you feel that the new generation of young adults are maybe hearing your stories better than those that are than the older generation? So might the change of this story or the narrative might come from them as well?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the young people have always been the people who have changed societies throughout history. We can look always anywhere. The driving force is most often young people, and it's often people who don't have enough power or don't feel that their voices are heard that will raise the voices the most. So obviously, we will make sure that they also can understand and use this as a way of telling their stories and their ideas on the future. And so the moment you start to think about that, well, the youth today, they're not, they don't do enough good, or their voices are too high, or they claim things that are sort of too much. It only shows that you become middle-aged, nothing else. The old world has always changed that way with criticism, and it's a way of life. And in a way, you can still look at climate change as something that will go over during time, because we will have newer generation, and they will be better decision makers than older people, because you have different concepts. They grew up with the concept of climate change, such as younger people who grew up with internet, and older people like myself didn't do. So obviously it's going to change, but I think there's a big opportunity to live a better life already now, and that's the story we want to tell.
Story can have an impact, and you know that with great power comes big responsibilities. Some stories can be turned to populism. How do you approach this topic? When people, who should we listen to, so to say? Should we listen to scientists? Should we listen to people that popularize science? Should we listen to politicians? There are many stories that come to our everyday world that we have to filter and make sense of them. How do you make sense of all this?
I think it's a very good point you're making here. I mean, the labels we put to the stories we tell, basis on our perspective. If I tell something, obviously it's information, it's neutral and it's good. If you tell something, it's propaganda and we should stay away from it. That's the way you always treat your political opponent. But I think that we could actually, I mean, the old sort of the analogy here is sort of the knife. It could be used for good things and for bad things. And of course, this kind of storytelling can be used for popular reasons as well, as a framework that would basically work for any story. But we've tried to also think about the populism that has arisen throughout Europe and in the US in the past year to see what kinds of stories do they tell. And then they are very effective in telling stories that are emotionally based and connected to your local, the way you see it locally. Donald Trump often said that I feel this to be true. And that's actually factual. That's one of the few facts he said. That's how we feel things to be true. Everything we understand, learn, is filtered through our already idea of the world. Obviously, I have to say, and I think as sort of working in sort of a government program and with lots of academics, and also being a journalist by trade, you should listen to the facts. You should check your sources, and you should be skeptical also to media. Demand that we give you sources and give you ways to look it up. You shouldn't take things for face value to start with. And the more we demand people to reveal their sources and where they got any information from, the better for everyone. And that includes politicians. There's too many populist politicians, but asking them for a plan, asking them for concrete facts, asking them how they build it up, then we come into politics. But I think we sort of, it's a responsibility we all have. What are we sharing? What are we reading? Are we giving are we having an enough balanced diet of the things we consume, or are we just sort of reading the stuff that our crazy uncles post on Facebook? Because everybody has a crazy uncle that posts the most outrageous conspiracy theories on Facebook. Do we go in and say, hey, you're crazy, old man? Could be difficult, especially if it's Thanksgiving or Christmas and you want to sit next to him. So we might just want, I think, I encourage everyone just sort of post a question, sort of passive aggressive, but still. What's your source on this? Where did you get that from? So that's just a perfect thing to post in a comment. Okay, interesting. Where do you get that from? Could be said very neutrally. And then starting to reclaim sources and facts. You are entitled to opinions, but not to your own facts. And if someone has better facts, then we better change.
Thank you very much, Per. Thank you for this interesting, insightful discussion. There is a last question from Tom that I'm going to ask, and great closing question. Do you do something that you know is really unsustainable, but you can't help yourself and keep doing it? That you know that you could do better. You know that you could do better, and
I can do better in almost every area. Even though I try to live within the planetary boundaries and do that, of course I could do more. And I think that I try to remember myself that not to be complacent, not to be that sort of the almost sort of a mock image of sort of a Scrumman working for Sweden, basically saying, hello, we are from Sweden, we have a better system than you guys. Be full of ourselves and I think you have to be humble and reflective and realize that there's still a lot of things I can do in lots of areas. And especially you learn more, you thought you were good, but then you learned more and then you learn even more. And then I thought, I have carpool, so that's fine. And then I realized, well, there's not an electric carpool. And then we have to switch, and they were horrible. We had to switch back. But constantly keep trying, constantly be curious, trying to find better solutions is one of my driving forces. And the main inspiration I get is from city mayors, people constantly trying small and big projects, envisioning a better future for all. And there's lots and lots of things going on, and that inspires me every day.
Thank you very much, Per. Thank you. I wish you in your project a better future and for all the cities. And thank you for coming and joining our Urban Talks today in Prague. And have a great evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure and an honor.
Thank you. And I would like to thank you guys for joining us today. Please don't hesitate to visit Kempui online for more discussions, and I am very glad to welcome you next time for our talks. Thank you and have a nice evening.